Amadi and Ataku had been married for 5 years, living quietly in the remote village of Obago. Though their love for each other was deep and unwavering, there was one thing missing in their lives: a child. At first, they weren't too worried. They believed that in time, the gods would bless them with a child. But as the years slipped by, their patience turned into silent worry. It started with small glances at other families, then nights filled with questions and longing. Eventually, they began visiting spiritualists and healers, traveling far and wide to seek help. Some promised hope, some told them to be patient, that the right time would come. Though exhausted by disappointment, Amadi never blamed his wife. He stood by her, always gentle and full of hope, holding her hand through every failed prayer and remedy. Despite their heartache, their bond stayed strong. One morning, Ataku went to the market, hoping to buy ingredients for a pot of soup. The sun was already high, and the market buzzed with the usual noise of bargaining and chatter. As she walked through the crowded stalls, she noticed an old woman who looked frail and worn, going from trader to trader asking for food. No one paid her any attention. In fact, most drove her away, afraid she might bring bad luck to their sales. But something stirred in Ataku's heart. Despite having little money herself, she felt a deep pity for the woman. She walked over and gently asked what she needed. The woman, voice thin and tired, said she just wanted a timber of yam to eat. Without hesitation, Ataku bought 2 and even offered to help carry them home. On the way, the old woman suddenly stopped, looked deeply at her, and called her Mama Ugona. Ataku froze. She turned around to see if the woman was speaking to someone else, but they were alone. Confused, she said, "I'm not Mama Ugona." The old woman smiled and replied, "You aren't? But now you are. Your son has come." The woman's words didn't make full sense at the time, but there was something comforting and powerful about them. She continued, saying the child would soar like an eagle, bring light where there was darkness, and though he would face trials, the gods would protect him. Ataku stood speechless, her heart pounding in a mix of disbelief and hope. The old woman urged her to go home and tell her husband the good news. Ataku ran all the way back, clutching onto the moment like a lifeline. She told Amadi everything, and though surprised, he chose to believe because something about it felt different. Weeks passed, and their hope turned into reality. Ataku was pregnant. For the first time in years, joy filled their home. They sang, they prayed, and they waited. 9 months later, Ataku gave birth to a baby boy. They named him Ugona. From the moment he arrived, he brought peace to their home. He was quiet, alert, and full of warmth. Holding him, Amadi felt as though all those years of waiting had been worth it. It wasn't just about having a child, it was this child, this moment. And though they didn't yet understand the meaning behind the old woman's prophecy, they felt deep down that Ugona was meant for something great. Ugona's birth brought an overwhelming sense of peace to Amadi and Ataku. Their home, once quiet and filled with longing, now echoed with the soft sounds of a baby. Ugona was an unusually calm child, rarely crying, always watching the world with wide, curious eyes. He brought a new rhythm to their lives, one that felt fuller, warmer, more complete. But the joy did not last long. Only a year after Ugona was born, Ataku fell gravely ill. They tried everything: herbs, healers, endless prayers, but nothing worked. And one morning, with Ugona still too young to speak, she passed away. Amadi was crushed. The woman he had built a life with, waited 5 long years for a child with, was gone. He would sit for hours holding Ugona, staring off into the distance, unsure how to move forward. There were no close relatives to lean on, no family to help raise the baby. And so 6 months later, he made the difficult decision to remarry, not out of love, but necessity. The woman he married, Naya, was kind at first, hopeful with the baby, and Amadi hoped she would be a mother figure Ugonna could come to love. As time passed, their new family began to settle into a rhythm. Naya soon gave birth to a son of her own, whom they named Aiken. The two boys grew up together, and in the early years, they shared toys, stories, and laughter. But even then, it was clear that Ugonna was different. He was wise beyond his years, speaking with an oddly mature tone, and he possessed a quiet strength that made others take notice. He wasn't boastful, but he stood out without even trying. Amadi noticed this, and his pride in Ugonna was impossible to hide. He spoke of him often to neighbors and friends, praising his kindness, his brilliance, and his heart. Akin, though a bright boy in his own way, didn't shine the same. His talents lay elsewhere. He had a knack for crafting things with his hands, showing great interest in weaving and pottery, leaving in pottery. Amadai acknowledged Aiken's skills, but the admiration he held for Ugonna was on a different level. This didn't sit well with Naya. She watched as Amadi's eyes lit up when Ugonna entered a room, how he listened more attentively to Ugonna's stories, and how the boy's presence reminded him of his late wife. Slowly, resentment took root in her heart. At first, Naya tried to hide it, telling herself that she could eventually win more of her husband's attention through her own son. But Ugonna's natural charisma made that impossible. Everyone in the village loved him. He was respectful, generous, and had a way of making others feel safe and seen. Akin, on the other hand, wasn't even competing. He loved his brother and was content with their relationship. But Naya couldn't accept that. She began whispering in Aiken's ear, telling him that Ugonna was trying to steal what was rightfully his. She planted seeds of jealousy where none existed, slowly turning Akin against his brother. From then on, she started treating Ugonna differently. She made him do most of the chores, while Aiken was allowed to play or relax. She watched, waiting for Ugonna to complain or falter, but he never did. The twin daughters she later gave birth to, strong and lively like their older brother, also gravitated toward Ugonna, sneaking off to help him whenever they could. No matter what Naya did, Ugonna continued to shine, and the more he shone, the deeper her bitterness grew. It was no longer just envy, it was hatred. And from that hatred, a dangerous plan began to take shape in her mind. She knew that as long as Ugonna lived, her son could never rise above him. As time went on, Naya's hatred for Ugonna festered into something dangerous. No amount of tours, cold words, or manipulation could dim the boy's light. If anything, he seemed to grow even stronger under the weight of her cruelty. That made her angrier. She watched her son Aiken quietly drift away from his once close brother just as she had intended. Ugonna still treated him kindly, still tried to include him in everything, but the bond they once shared had slowly cracked under the pressure of Naya's poisonous whispers. The twin girls, on the other hand, could not be turned. They adored their older brother and never believed the false stories their mother tried to feed them. But Naya refused to give up. Her mind became consumed with the idea that Ugonna had to disappear for good. So when news spread across the village that a new brutal law had been passed to deal with rising theft, anyone caught stealing would be buried alive, Naya saw an opportunity. The law terrified many parents. It was harsh, even extreme, but Naya didn't see it as a warning, she saw it as a weapon. One afternoon, Naya told Ugonna she needed help picking up some items. He followed her without chin, as he always did, unaware of what she had planned. She led him to the farm of a poor elderly widow and pointed at a bunch of ripe plantains. She told him she had already paid for them and asked him to cut them down. Ugonna, careful as always, hesitated. "Are you sure, Mama?" he asked. She nodded with a smile, lying straight to his face. "Yes, I've already spoken to her," she said. Trusting her, Ugonna started cutting down the plantains. That was when Naya suddenly began to scream, loud and frantic. She shouted like she'd just witnessed a terrible crime. Ugonna froze, confused, still holding the cutlass. Before he could speak, villagers began running toward the commotion. Naya grabbed him and screamed louder, accusing him of stealing from the widow. The crowd saw a young boy holding a cutlass standing beside cut-down plantains, and they believed the worst. Ugonna tried to explain, but Naya wouldn't let him speak. She cried and shouted over him, claiming she had caught him in the act. The villagers didn't question her. He was dragged to the king's palace like a criminal. Word spread fast, and Amadi rushed to the palace with his daughters and Aiken, refusing to believe his son was capable of theft. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. The king had already begun the hearing. Naya was the first to testify. She stood before the crowd with tears streaming down her face, calling Ugonna a troubled boy she had tried so hard to love and protect. She painted a picture of a rebellious child, saying he had even threatened to kill her when she tried to stop him. Her performance was heartbreaking. Many in the crowd believed her completely. When Ugonna was finally allowed to speak, his voice trembled with hurt. He told them what really happened, how his stepmother had led him there and told him the plantains were already paid for. But his words fell on deaf ears. The villagers had already made up their minds. The king, unmoved by his pleas, gave the verdict without hesitation. Take him away and bury him alive. The sentence was met with gasps, some of horror, others of grim satisfaction. Amadi collapsed in shock, screaming that his son was innocent, offering to pay double for the plantains, begging for mercy. But no one listened. Ugonna, tied and broken-hearted, was taken to the burial site. Naa stood by pretending to weep while secretly rejoicing. Akin, now poisoned with jealousy, watched in silence. And just like that, the boy who had brought light into their home was lowered into the earth, betrayed by the very people he had trusted most. As Ugonna was buried beneath the soil, the weight of his father's grief was too heavy for words. Amadi stood frozen, his heart shattered, staring at the spot where his son had disappeared. His daughters clung to his arms, crying as they tried to pull him away. Everything he had once dreamed of, the life he was supposed to build with Adiku, the promise of their miracle child, had been taken from him in the cruelest way. That night, he sat outside the hut, motionless, his eyes dull with heartbreak. Naa came home wearing a mask of sorrow, trying to speak to him as if nothing had happened. But Amadi didn't respond. He had heard the rumors. People whispered that Naya was the one who raised the alarm, claiming Ugonna had tried to attack her with a cutlass. Deep down, Amadi had always known she harbored resentment toward the boy, but he never thought she would go this far. He said nothing to her, but something inside him had died along with Ugonna. From that moment on, their relationship became hollow. He refused to eat her food, refused to speak a single word to her, and barely acknowledged her presence. Nala sensed the shift. Though she acted like everything was fine, her behavior changed. She began sneaking out of the house at odd hours, walking like someone who was constantly looking over her shoulder. The twins noticed, and so did Amadi, but he kept silent, watching her carefully. He had a growing suspicion, but was waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Days passed like that, quiet, tense, filled with unspoken grief and growing distance. Then one morning, just as the sun began to warm the village, a man barged into the compound. He was younger than Amadi, but his voice was filled with bitterness and urgency. "I'm here for my son," he said flatly. Amadi blinked, confused. "Who are you?" he asked. The man replied, "I'm Obi-I. Nawa was my woman before you took her. She got pregnant with my son, Aiken. I've waited all these years for her to bring him to me, but she kept lying. I want him now." Amadi sat still, letting the weight of the man's words sink in. Everything began to make sense: Aiken's different nature, Naya's erratic behavior, the strange restlessness she had shown after Ugonna's death. She had been hiding the truth all along. Without saying a word, Amadai called for his daughters. "Go bring your mother," he said quietly. When Naya stepped outside and saw Obi standing beside Amity, she froze in her tracks. Her face turned pale, and she tried to run, but Obi caught her with his voice. I told you I would come. Bring me my son. Moments later, Akin stepped outside, confused. Obi rushed over and embraced him, calling him my son. Akin stood there stunned. Amadi didn't say much. He simply looked at Obi and said, "Take your son, take your two." I have no use for either of them. Naya dropped to her knees, pleading with Amadi, tears running down her face. But he wouldn't even look at her. He went inside, gathered her belongings, and threw them out. As Naya and Akin walked away in shame, Amadi stood quietly at the doorway, watching the family he had never truly belonged to leave for good. The twins stood by their father, eyes full of sadness and quiet strength. Though it didn't bring Ugonna back, a part of the darkness that had consumed their home had finally been lifted. Aero? Still, deep in Amadi's heart, the only thought that lingered was, if only the truth had come sooner, maybe Ugonna would still be alive. Far away from Obago, in a quiet village surrounded by thick forest, a man named Decay returned from a long day of hunting. He called out softly as he approached his small hut, and from within, a young man stepped out tall, quiet, his eyes carrying a heavy past. It was Ugonna. Miraculously, he had survived the burial. That night, months ago, Decay had happened to be hunting near Obago when he saw the villagers digging a grave. Curious, he watched from the shadows until everyone left. In the dead of night, guided by something he couldn't explain, he returned and began digging. To his astonishment, Ugonna was still breathing, barely clinging to life. Decay took him in, cared for him, and nursed him back to health. Ugonna never forgot the pain, not just from being buried alive, but the betrayal. The people he loved, his family, his village, they had turned against him without question. Even though Decay treated him like a son, the emotional wounds ran deep. For a long time, he refused to speak of the past. He simply worked, helped around the village, and lived in silence. One night, Ugonna had a dream. In it, he saw a great staff, a symbol of authority lying in the dust, and a voice urging him to return home. When he awoke, something strange happened. The Afo, the sacred staff of kingship in Obago, was lying beside his bed. He stared at it for a long time, heart pounding. He knew the Afo had gone missing from the palace, and its absence had likely thrown the village into chaos. When he told Decay, the old hunter nodded solemnly. "It's time," he said. "You were born for something greater. Your people need you." But Ugonna shook his head. He couldn't forgive them, not after what they did. "They buried me like I was nothing," he said. "Let them suffer without a king." Still, Decay remained gentle. "You don't have to go back for them," he said quietly. "Go back for your father, for your sisters." For the truth, it was that last part that stuck with Ugonna. He had spent so long trying to bury the pain, but part of him still longed for closure. A week later, with the Afo wrapped carefully in cloth, he and Decay began the journey back to Obago. As they neared the village, Ugonna noticed how everything looked the same, but somehow felt different. The moment they stepped into the outskirts, a woman spotted him and screamed in terror. "A ghost!" she cried and ran off. More people saw him and scattered, convinced they were seeing a spirit. But Ugonna kept walking, calm and focused. Decay told him to ignore the panic and go straight to the palace. By the time they arrived, the Council of Elders was already gathering. Whispers flew like wildfire. Ugonna, the boy buried alive, was standing in the king's court. When Amadi heard the news, he rushed to the palace. The moment he saw Ugonna, he broke down in tears. He ran to him, embraced him tightly, and sobbed. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I couldn't protect you. I failed your mother." I let evil into our home." Eugena stood still at first, overwhelmed. His father's arms were shaking, his voice full of regret. And though pain still lingered, the love in that moment was undeniable. Without a word, Eugena pulled the offo from his bag. The entire council stood up in shock. The sacred staff had returned just as the king had died, and the land had remained dreary and cursed. Eugena didn't say much. He simply placed the offo in its rightful spot. And in that moment, thunder rumbled in the sky. After months of drought, the rain began to fall. As soon as the offo touched its rightful place in the palace, the skies broke open. Rain fell heavily for the first time in months, washing over the dry lands of Obago like a long-awaited blessing. The villagers who had once turned their backs on Eugena fell to their knees in awe and shame. The drought that had punished them ever since the staff disappeared now felt like divine justice, and Eugena, once condemned as a thief, stood as the very symbol of redemption. As he explained everything, how he had been framed by Naya, how he had begged for mercy, how Decay had rescued him and nursed him back to life, the room grew silent. People cried openly, not just from guilt, but from the weight of knowing they had buried an innocent boy alive. The elders approached him with humility, asking for forgiveness. Eugena nodded quietly. He had carried the pain for so long, but in that moment, standing in the same place where his life had been nearly stolen, he chose peace. Not because they deserved it, but because holding on to hate would have kept him buried longer than the earth ever did. News spread quickly that Eugena was not only alive, but chosen by destiny. With the offo in his possession and the king gone, the council declared him the rightful ruler of Obago. The village celebrated, though under a cloud of reflection. Eugena was crowned king, and one of his first acts was to bring his father and twin sisters into the palace to live with him. They had remained loyal in their hearts, and now they were finally reunited as a family. As for Decay, the man who saved him without asking for anything in return, Eugena appointed him the royal hunter, a position of great honor. Meanwhile, Naya, who had run away the moment she heard Eugena was alive, was never seen again. Her son Ekin had already been taken by his true father to another village, far from the consequences of her actions. Life in Obago slowly returned to normal, but the people never forgot what happened. Eugena ruled with wisdom and grace, guided not just by the scars of his past, but by the lessons they taught him. He married a kind and humble woman, built a life of peace, and made sure that justice in his reign would never again be as blind and cruel as the justice that once condemned him. This story, though wrapped in folklore, reflects something painfully real in our world. People are often quick to judge, quick to point fingers without understanding the full truth. Eugena was buried not just in soil, but in lies, in prejudice, in blind trust of someone who spoke louder than him. How often do we do the same? How often do we silence someone just because they don't have the power or voice to defend themselves? Sometimes the people closest to us can betray us, and sometimes the people we barely know, like Decay, can be the ones who save us. Eugena's journey reminds us that no matter how deeply we are buried by pain, by injustice, or by the wrongdoings of others, destiny has a way of digging us back out. And when it does, we are not just restored, we are reborn. So whatever you're going through, remember this. Your story isn't over just because someone else says it is. Keep going. Keep believing. Because what is meant for you will always find its way, even if it has to claw through the dirt to get there.